Okay, so last little bit then of the obedience section of social influence. So we've already established at this point that when we introduced obedience, that Milgram has concluded that people obey authority figures. So that was what he found and concluded from his original research with the electric shock experiment. We've also recently looked at how Adorno then concluded that there could potentially be some dispositional factors that could affect obedience. So that's to do with people's internal personality. So we've looked at the authoritarian personality. So now we're going to move on to looking at whether there are factors in the environment or the situation or the context that could make levels of obedience more or less likely. So these are going to be the situational factors. We're also going to look a little bit at some psychological factors as well. So things going on in your mind that might make it more likely that you would follow orders of authority. So first, so there are kind of three main situational factors that Milgram manipulated. So every time he reproduced the same original study, but he manipulated certain variables. And the first one was proximity. So in the original study, the teacher and the learner, so remember the genuine, real, naive participant was the teacher, and the learner was the confederate who was in on it. So initially they were in separate rooms in his original electric shock study so that they couldn't see each other. At this point in his original finding, we know that there was 65% of those participants, of those teachers, that administered the full 450 volts, and 100% of those participants gave up to 300 volts, so they fully obeyed the authority, which was the guy in the lab coat. So Milgram decided to run another variation of this study, but instead he placed the teacher and the learner in the same room so they could now see each other. And he found that by doing this, the obedience rate actually decreased, so it dropped from what he found in the original study, which was 65% of obedience when they couldn't see each other, to only 40%. So have a think about potentially why obedience is less likely to occur when you can actually see the person in front of you. So potentially there could be lots of reasons for this, but I know for sure that if I was giving someone electric shocks and I could see them in person, and I would feel a lot more guilty that they were kind of judging what I was doing, as opposed to not even being able to take responsibility because you can't even see they're in a different room, that sort of thing. So he also manipulated the location of the study. So in the original study, the electric shock one, it was conducted in a prestigious university, in Yale University. So this is a very kind of high-end, prestigious law university, kind of same level as Harvard, Stanford. It's a kind of Ivy League university. And this is where his original study was carried out. So you can imagine why obedience here would be quite high, because people think, well, this is a legitimate university, it's very high end, very prestigious, and therefore obedience is high. So what he decided to do was to kind of reverse that, and this time he changed the location to a derelict building. So this is a building that's sort of run down, very kind of dodgy, not very legitimate looking type building. And by doing this, he found that compared to the 65%, again in his original study, obedience dropped yet again to 47%. So again, it's kind of indicating that people think, well, why should I do what you say? We're in a kind of run-down, derelict building. It doesn't seem very legitimate to me. And therefore, they were more likely to kind of stop giving those electric shocks much earlier on. So obedience decreased. And then in the final variation, Milgram decided to change what the experimenter was wearing. So if you remember in the original study, the experimenter wore a white lab coat, so that was the kind of symbol of his authority. In the manipulation, in the variation, Milgram decided to make the experimenter wear ordinary clothes, so obviously they wouldn't have any symbol of authority, and this actually caused obedience rates to drop the most out of all other variations. So he found that conformity dropped to 20%, Whereas obviously in the original one where he was wearing a lab coat, it was 65% conformity, obedience. I'm saying conformity. So quite a big difference in obedience levels there when the experimenter is wearing normal people clothes. So these were the sort of representation of the findings. You've got there on the left the baseline study, so that's the real study, the original one, 65% obeyed. And then here you've got 47.5% when they changed the location to the rundown building, the derelict building, 40% when they changed proximity, so they were in the same room. There's a couple other ones here. So there was another variation where they forced the learner's hand onto a plate, which is not very nice. So they were in the same room, and then they said that the teacher, so the participant, had to actually make the person's hand go onto the electric shock plate. They didn't like doing that, so that made obedience drop again further. This one, the experimenter gave the orders by phone, so they can actually see the authority figure, and that made it less likely that they would obey. And then the lowest, they were played by a normal member of the public in terms of wearing normal people clothes, and they didn't obey at all. Really well, 20%, not very much. There's a video here for you to have a look at to help. It's quite a funny video. So this guy, I'll give you a little brief summary, but this guy dresses up as a policeman or security officer and goes around telling people to do things, and it's quite funny because they pretty much just do whatever he says, because why wouldn't they? He looks like he's an authority figure. And then there's just some evaluation here for you. Again, you need to kind of start getting into the habit now that you're kind of moving into second year of just reading the first line of an evaluative point like this and being able to kind of assume and logically discuss it and elaborate yourself. So I'm not going to explain these in a lot of detail, but basically a study by Bickman, they dressed up people in different uniforms, so either a milkman, a suit and tie, or a security guard, and then members of the public were asked by each of those different uniformed people to pick up litter, and then they found that the security guard outfit produced the highest amount of obedience, which is kind of logical. Cross-cultural application, so Milgram replicated the variations in different countries, and they found similar results across the different situational factors, so it suggests that it's got good cross-cultural validity, which are good. Lack of internal validity, so this is one of the issues of Milgram's original study as well, was that it wasn't real to life, demand characteristics, it was fake, ecological validity, it was a lab study, all of that stuff. So you could argue that even more so on the variations, there would be more demand characteristics because he's manipulating and changing more of the studies. So it kind of gives the opportunity for people to figure out what's going on because he's messing with it more and more, if that makes sense. High reliability. So again, the original study wasn't really replicated that much, but the variations were replicated. So by the end of it, you could argue that the variations of the situational factors by Milgram do have quite a high level of reliability because they were reproduced and again reproduced cross-culturally as well. So it can increase the generalizability and the reliability of that research. Looking at some psychological variables. So psychological and situational are different, but psychological is more to do with what's going on in the person's head in terms of the pressure that they're feeling from these authority figures. And you just really need to know a couple of definitions. So these are looking at how others can influence our behaviour and psychological state. So again, looking at what's really going on in the mind. So you've got something called the agentic state, and this is about people obeying because they feel like they are then acting under someone else's authority. So that's the word agent. So agentic basically means you kind of feel like you're not really responsible for what you're doing because you're just being told to do it. So an example of this is if I was to, because obviously I've as a teacher have some authority over you as students. So if I said, oh, can you run down the corridor, and I specifically said I want you to run, and then you get caught by another teacher and they say, why are you running? I can guarantee almost all of you would say, oh, well, I was told to by another teacher. And you then do it because you think, well, if I get in trouble, it's not really my responsibility because I'm acting as an agent under someone else's command. Okay, so that's the agentic state, as another reason why you might obey. An autonomous state, so this is kind of when you switch from feeling like you're in control of what you're doing to an agentic state. So it's known as an agentic shift. So when you perceive someone to be of legitimate authority, you kind of feel like you make a shift, and instead of acting under your own choices, you start to act under someone else's decisions and choices that you're being told to do. So it could mean that you're more likely to obey, or it could mean that you're more likely to resist if you feel like you have a higher autonomous state and you're not going to act under someone else's authority. So again, that will come more clear when we look at resistance to social influence. Last one, legitimacy of authority. So this is quite an obvious one. You're more likely to obey someone if their authority is legitimate. So if there's someone that's a police officer, you're much more likely to obey them because they have a structured position in the hierarchy which is above us. So most people in society will agree that someone of that authority is legitimate, and therefore they're willing to give up some of their independence and freedom to trust that those figures are there to kind of abide by the laws and enforce the laws and punish wrongdoers and use their authority properly, and therefore we're more likely to trust those people and more likely to do what they say. Okay, so if a police officer told us to do something, we kind of respect that that's their job and that they're probably doing the right thing, so we're more comfortable to do that. So there's a couple studies I want you to have a look at that are going to support legitimacy of authority as a psychological explanation, and another one by Killam and Mann that I want you to have a look at, and I want you to just summarise them briefly and note down what they would suggest about legitimacy of authority. And then again, there's just some evaluative points here for the psychological factors. The psychological factors isn't really a massive little subtopic. It's more the situational ones that you'd probably be questioned on more, but this could be like a couple of short answer questions on these sorts of things. So it's still good that you should have some evaluation on that. So I've just given you like a couple. You can also use obviously these studies for support as strengths, and then these as a couple of negative evaluative points. Okay, so again, you can pause the video as and when to kind of read through and help elaborate on those in the Peel style format. Okay, so that's it for that one.